90 minutes before 50% tariffs were set to hit $20 billion of Canadian exports, Trump paused the deadline. And the phrase Mark Carney has been repeating to reporters throughout this entire standoff wasn't some diplomatic pleasantry. It was 3 words in French: Maîtres, Chez, Nous, masters in our own home. Carney didn't just use it once for effect either. He told reporters days before the deadline that he might personally translate it for Trump during their next call, calling it a lesson. 3 words, a phrase born out of Quebec's own fight for economic independence generations ago, now being aimed directly at the President of the United States in the final hours of a trade standoff worth billions of dollars. Here's what we're covering. First, we'll unpack where this phrase actually comes from, because its history makes Carney's use of it against Trump specifically almost impossible to read as accidental. Then we'll walk through exactly what happened in the real final hours before the deadline, the phone calls, the statement, and the actual pause itself. After that, we'll get into what Carney has said publicly about being ready for any outcome, because his own words reveal a level of preparation that goes well beyond hoping for the best. We'll look honestly at how much credit a single phrase can actually claim in a negotiation this complex. And finally, we'll talk about what this moment reveals about the posture Canada is bringing into these talks, regardless of how much weight you put on any 3 specific words. Let's start with the phrase itself, because understanding where it comes from changes how you read Carney using it now. Maîtres, Chez, Nous, masters in our own home, is one of the most historically loaded political slogans in Canadian history, tracing back to Quebec's quiet revolution in the 1960s, when the province fought to wrestle economic and political control of its own resources away from outside interests, largely English, Canadian, and American corporate ownership at the time. It's a phrase about sovereignty, about a smaller, historically overshadowed player refusing to let a larger outside power dictate the terms of its own economy. According to reporting from the Epoch Times, Carney has repeatedly invoked this exact phrase in response to Trump's tariffs and his repeated comments about Canada becoming the 51st state, and said on August 17th, while announcing a major new hydroelectric energy partnership in Newfoundland, that he might personally translate the phrase for Trump as what he called a lesson. Choosing that specific historical phrase with that specific history of resisting outside economic domination to describe Canada's posture toward the United States isn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It's worth understanding just how deep this phrase runs in Quebec's political memory before assuming Carney chose it casually. Maîtres, Chez, Nous became the rallying cry of Jean Lesage's Liberal government in the early 1960s, built around the nationalization of the province's private electricity companies, an assertion that Quebecers, not outside investors, would control the resources sitting inside their own borders. It became shorthand for an entire era of Quebec reclaiming economic self-determination after decades of feeling like a junior partner inside its own province. For an English-speaking prime minister from outside Quebec to reach specifically for this phrase, repeatedly, in the context of a trade standoff with the United States, is a genuinely notable rhetorical choice, borrowing one of Canadian history's most potent symbols of resource sovereignty and redirecting it at Washington instead of at the historical target it was originally built to confront. Now let's walk through what actually happened in those final hours, because the real sequence matters more than any single dramatic moment. Carney spoke with Trump by phone twice in the days leading up to the deadline, according to his office, first on a Monday afternoon, and again the following Tuesday, with the substance of those calls not publicly disclosed beyond Carney describing the negotiations to reporters as very intense and delicate. On August 18th, with the deadline bearing down, Carney's office released an official statement confirming that after weeks of intensive discussions, substantial progress though important work remained, and that the United States had agreed to postpone implementation of the 50% Section 338 tariffs until the end of day on August 21st. That's the actual mechanism behind the pause, a negotiated postponement following direct, repeated leader-to-leader contact, not a single quote landing like a knockout blow. The timeline leading up to that final stretch is worth laying out too, because it shows just how long this specific push had already been building before those final 90 minutes. Canadian trade officials had spent days camped out in Washington working through a detailed, sector-by-sector list of what Bloomberg described as trade irritants the United States wanted, addressed before backing off the new duties. Marieke Walsh, a journalist closely tracking the talks, reported that the entire outcome was ultimately going to come down to the specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, according to Brian Clough, who'd played a major role in past Canadian trade negotiations. That's a negotiation built on weeks of granular, unglamorous groundwork, industry-specific concessions, quota structures, and content formulas, not a single dramatic phone call resolving everything in one conversation. Carney's own public comments throughout this stretch reveal just how deliberately prepared his government was for every possible outcome, not just the good one. Speaking to reporters, he was directly asked whether his government would provide assistance for affected businesses or impose reciprocal tariffs if the American duties actually took effect. His answer was blunt and confident. "I have a plan that will cover all eventualities." Days earlier, in Charlottetown, after meeting with Canada's premiers, he'd made an even more pointed pledge. One Bloomberg reported he has repeated many times throughout this standoff, "Canada will not accept a bad deal." Asked specifically whether he was ready to hit back if talks collapsed entirely, Carney told CBC News plainly he was ready for any possible scenario, saying, "I have plans for any situation that may arise." That's not the language of a leader hoping a clever phrase might charm Trump into backing down. That's the language of someone who built contingency planning into every stage of this negotiation from the start. There's an interesting wrinkle in Carney's public posture worth including too, because it complicates any simple narrative of Canada holding every possible card in reserve. When directly asked about using energy exports as leverage against the United States, Carney told reporters he didn't, quote, "see the value in that approach specifically," a notable contrast to how aggressively some provincial premiers, particularly Doug Ford with his electricity surcharge threats, have talked about wielding energy as a weapon in this standoff. That distinction matters. It suggests Carney's federal strategy has been more selective and calibrated than a blanket willingness to escalate on every available front, reserving the loudest threats for provincial leaders while keeping the federal government's public posture focused on structured, sector-specific negotiation instead. To be fair, and this matters for keeping this story honest, no single three-word phrase, however historically loaded, single-handedly stops a president from imposing a tariff package this large. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Canada's chief negotiator Janice Charette, and teams of officials on both sides spent days camped out in intensive, detailed talks in Washington, working through specific sector-by-sector issues, steel, aluminum, autos, and the provincial alcohol bans that ultimately shaped the actual terms of the pause and the deal taking form around it. Quebec Premier Christine Fréchette was separately fighting for reduced aluminum tariffs without giving up major concessions on dairy. And Business Council of Canada CEO Goldie Hyder noted publicly just how complicated it is to negotiate a deal that satisfies premiers across the political spectrum simultaneously. This was a genuinely complex, multi-front negotiation, not a moment resolved by rhetoric alone. That complexity is worth sitting with a bit longer because it's easy for a dramatic headline to flatten what was actually a genuinely difficult federal balancing act. Canada isn't a single, unified negotiating voice in the way the phrase-driven framing might suggest. It's a federation where individual premiers control real levers, provincial liquor boards, procurement rules, electricity exports, that the federal government in Ottawa doesn't fully control on its own. Getting Ontario, Quebec, and every other affected province aligned behind a single negotiating position, while still leaving room for Carney to speak with one voice on the phone with Trump, is its own significant diplomatic achievement, arguably a bigger one than any single rhetorical flourish delivered to reporters. But here's why the phrase still matters, even accounting for that complexity. Carney didn't reach for generic diplomatic language when describing Canada's posture in this fight. He reached specifically for a slogan about sovereignty and resistance to outside economic control, used it repeatedly and publicly, and openly discussed translating it directly for Trump as a pointed lesson rather than softening it for American ears. That's not an accident of word choice. That's a calculated signal about how Canada sees itself in this negotiation, not as a smaller partner hoping for mercy, but as a country insisting, in the most historically resonant language available to it, that the terms of its own economy remain its own to decide. So that's the full picture, a 90-minute pause built on weeks of intensive negotiation, direct leader-to-leader phone calls, and detailed contingency planning across every Canadian sector exposed to these tariffs, wrapped around a prime minister who chose, again and again, to describe his country's posture using three words with a very specific history of refusing outside control. There's something worth noticing in how deliberately Carney has paired that rhetoric with concrete preparation, rather than letting it stand alone as empty symbolism. Plenty of leaders reach for a stirring phrase during a tense negotiation and leave it at that. Carney paired his with an explicit, on-record commitment to a plan covering every possible outcome, win, lose, or stalemate, delivered in the same stretch of interviews where he kept returning to Maîtres, Chez, Nous. That combination, historically loaded language backed by genuinely detailed contingency planning, is a much harder position for the other side of a negotiation to simply wait out, because it signals Canada isn't just hoping for a good outcome, it's prepared for every outcome, and wants the other side to know it. One last thing worth remembering as the August 21st deadline approaches, phrases like Maîtres, Chez, Nous tend to outlive the specific negotiations that inspired them. Political language chosen this deliberately, tied this closely to a historical moment of resource sovereignty, doesn't simply disappear once this particular tariff dispute gets resolved one way or another. It becomes part of how Carney's government frames Canada's broader relationship with the United States going forward, a reference point future negotiators, journalists, and even opposition politicians will likely return to the next time this relationship hits a rough patch. Whether or not Trump ever actually hears that translation lesson directly, the phrase has already done its work simply by being repeated enough times, in enough interviews, that it's become inseparable from how this entire standoff gets remembered. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, do you think Carney actually gets to deliver that translation lesson to Trump directly? Or does this all get settled in the fine print long before it comes to that?